It's a little after 7, so we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us for our event, Silent Spring Revolution, a conversation with Douglas Brinkley. The Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and last April we celebrated our 32nd anniversary. And this event is also sponsored by Restore the North Woods. Restore is a nonprofit membership organization founded in 1992 by veteran conservationists and grassroots activists. Our event is also part of the Concord Festival of Authors, which is celebrating its 30th year. You can check out the festival events both in person and online at concordfestivalofauthors.org. And tonight, this is a Zoom webinar, so you are only able to see the host and the panelist. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having tech difficulties, and we'll do our best to help. And you can also use the chat to correspond with each other. And if you would like closed captioning, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And there will be an audience Q&A during the last 15 minutes or so of our event. You can enter any questions throughout in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen, and we will address those later. And I will now turn the program over to Kathy Anderson, Executive Director of the Walden Woods Project, who will introduce tonight's speaker. And now over to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us for this special presentation. We are both honored and delighted to welcome back our friend Doug Brinkley, who will discuss his forthcoming book, Silent Spring Revolution, which chronicles the great environmental awakening of the Long Sixties. I've had an opportunity to read portions of Doug's book, which will be published on November 15th. And it was so inspiring to be reintroduced to some of my environmental champions and to relive the extraordinary era when great environmental achievements were realized. I remember I was barely 10 years old when Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published, but I read it with the guidance of my parents. We had a modest summer cottage on the Westport River in Massachusetts, where a rare nesting osprey population inhabited 3 small islands. Their numbers were in serious decline, which we learned from Rachel Carson's book was due to DDT. Reading Silent Spring awakened in me a passion for wildlife preservation and natural resource preservation, which has stayed with me throughout my entire life. I also remember the first Earth Day, when the aspirations and optimism of a new generation were harnessed to save the planet. Those of us who rallied for the Earth on that spring day in 1970 believed anything was possible. And indeed, many things were possible in those times, as they are now. I recount these memories because I had the similar experiences I believe were shared by other baby boomers who grew up in the 60s as I did, and who are influenced by the great environmental awakening, and who, like myself, ended up pursuing careers or volunteer opportunities in the field of environmental protection. Doug's book comes at a most critical time for the world and for the human race. A time when another grassroots environmental movement holds the only realistic promise of saving the planet. It has been said that the true talent of a writer of history lies in his or her ability to bring history to life, to inspire, instruct, and engage. The bookcase behind me holds many of Doug's books, and each one of them brings history to life by drawing parallels between past and present. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce someone who I greatly admire, the chair in humanities and professor of history at Rice University, a CNN presidential historian, the recipient of 7 honorary doctorates in American studies, the author of 7 New York Times best-selling books, and the recipient of far too many awards to enumerate, Douglas Brinkley. Thank you, Doug, for being with us.
Thank you. I want everybody in our little club talk here to know that this is the launch of my book, Silent Spring Revolution, and I wanted to do it here because the Walden Woods Project means so much to me. My family goes to Concord and spends time in the woods around the pond. But when I grew up, and even today, when I'm asked the person I'd most like to meet, I ask who's influenced my life the most, the answer is Henry David Thoreau. And the reasons for that are manifest. It's because he wrote books that stay with me. You know, when I was writing this, there was a big moment in when John F. Kennedy was president, when it was the a big Dunbar Notes celebration of the writings of Thoreau, and Robert Frost came. And Frost said that Walden was the greatest storybook of all time. He put one of Darwin's books and Robinson Crusoe after it. And by that, he meant a storybook of just bringing a reader into a particular milieu. And I want you to know that Thoreau's, he's throughout this book, because for the 1960s and 70s environmental movement, and I call it in my book, the Long Sixties, it really begins in the year 1960, the presidential election run between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. JFK was very open in 1960 to preservation. He was somebody who loved Cape Cod, and as a senator, really cut his chops on selling this idea of a Cape Cod national seashore. That was his big Senate moment, and his teacher on all of that was Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. Bill Douglas, our longest serving Supreme Court justice, was kind of discovered by Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father. Bill Douglas was from Yakima, Washington, grew up with a polio-like condition, started healing his legs by hiking in the foothills and the arid valleys around Yakima. And by the time he ends up going to law school and at Columbia, and by the time he's a Sterling professor of law at Yale, he gets plucked by old Joe Kennedy and put on these stock market security exchange commission to kind of bust bad guys, bust people that were having bogus bankruptcy cases just to rip people off. But Douglas was a fervent Thoreauvian. He was, all of Thoreau's books were his Bibles. And he ended up, the Kennedy family taught their children. Rose Kennedy grew up near Concord, and she would teach the Kennedy kids how to swim in Walden Pond. True story. I've talked to Ted Kennedy about it, talked to a whole Kennedy family about it. And that was where their training grounds for swimming was, almost like a baptismal. So here, Douglas and the Kennedys are really into Henry David Thoreau, and it's 1960. And lo and behold, a writer from California is teaching at Stanford, writes an essay, the novelist Wallace Stegner. And Stegner talks about why wilderness is so important. And Stegner is very enamored with the essay Walking, in which Thoreau says, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And he's not alone, Stegner, but he writes this essay that circulates through the Democratic Party, influences Kennedy's New Frontier. And when Kennedy picked Stuart Udall as Interior Secretary, there became a revival of Henry David Thoreau, which was kinetic in the 1960s, because you had the president touting Thoreau, you had the Supreme Court Justice Douglas, you had a novelist of the Pulitzer Prize winning status of Wallace Stegner. And add into that mix, Thoreau was Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring in 1962. He was her all seasons hero. It's one of the more poignant places I've visited was the home on Berwick Avenue in Silver Spring, Maryland. I toured the home of Rachel Carson. It's privately owned now. And they've done this couple has done a magnificent job of keeping her home like it was when she died of cancer in 1964. And at her bedside when she died was Walden. And she was part of this tribe, this ilk that was inspired by Walden. So I trace all this in my book. So even though it's a book about the Long Sixties, 1960, and it ends in 1973 with the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act got passed but through Congress and the Senate. To give you an idea how our country was different, the Senate in 1973, on a very progressive legislation, Endangered Species Act, it passed in the Senate 92-0. That's how everybody wanted to save endangered species in 73. But right when that passed, you have the OPEC, the Arab oil embargo, you have high gasoline prices, you have killer inflation, and you have a big business community that was so frightened of the Thoreauvian revival, so frightened of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and William O. Douglas saying trees have standing, and Kennedy and Johnson passing all this legislation, and the first Earth Day in 1970 moving Richard Nixon to have to pass new environmental legislation, that there became a counter revolution against the conservation environmentalist of the Long Sixties. And that counter revolution gave birth to the Heritage Foundation, to American Enterprise Institute, to the Cato Institute. They were so afraid of being hyper-regulated. The Chamber of Commerces of America were worried that where does this end, this environmentalism? And the faucets got shut off eventually. I mean, Jimmy Carter did some great things. And, you know, you can look at Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Barack Obama and George Herbert Walker Bush. There are these great moments in environmental history that occur. But the revolution, the real third wave progressive environmental movement really peters out in 1973, and we haven't reclaimed it yet. We're always on the cusp of a climate change revolution where the whole country demands getting off of fossil fuels. One would have thought maybe 20 years ago we were on the cusp of that. But I come and talk to you today, and you read the front page of the New York Times about the United Nations. It's talking about it's worse than we even thought, the warming of the planet, that the amount of catastrophic flooding and tornadoes and hurricanes and northeasterners and drought and wildfires, we're really at the early stages of the age of climate change. And so our planet is going to be going through an extraordinary upheaval coming. And one of the questions I ask in my book is, can we launch a new Silent Spring revolution? Now, I mentioned to you a few of the players in my book already, with Rachel Carson and Kennedy and Douglas. But I would like for a moment to tell you, I begin the book in 1945, and I begin it with really Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We win World War II with the atomic bombs, but at what cost? And this idea of becoming nuclear supreme involved testing of nuclear weapons. And so willy-nilly, we were blowing up nuclear bombs in the Nevada desert, the Nevada Proving Grounds, later called the test site, and without any concern of radiation and fallout. So the modern environmental movement, and when I used a term that probably made no sense when I said third wave, but the first wave of modern environmentalism is Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot's generation, about 1901 to 1909. When Theodore Roosevelt was president and saved 234 million acres of wild America, he wasn't kidding when he said the protection of natural resources is the #1 objective in my administration. He's the only president that put that high. I mean, if you look at Joe Biden's list now, climate change is there, but it's not #1. And Barack Obama high, but not #1. But for Roosevelt's generation, it was conservation. That was the first reform movement. The second wave was FDR from 1933 to 1945. particularly projects like the Civilian Conservation Corps that planted billions of trees, the combating of drought and the Dust Bowl. FDR established during the Depression, and it's hard to wrap your head around a number this large, but he established 800 state parks. And then there are the big national parks of FDR, which you're dealing with Big Bend and Channel Islands and Joshua Tree, the Olympics. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of what FDR is doing. Isle Royal, Mammoth Cave. And it ends because in 45, Truman comes in, and Harry Truman is one of the least interested people you'll ever meet in environment and conservation. He flat out said about the American West, why is everybody trying to save dinosaur bones or antiquities of native people when all that matters is dams and getting oil and ranching irrigation. He just didn't have what I'm sure all of you on this lecture have. It's a love of the natural world. It just didn't affect him. And there are people like that. There are people that need bird song, that need sweet waters, that demand clean air, that are looking at, have a reverence of life for all the flora and fauna. And then there are a lot of people, called millions, tens of millions of people, who that doesn't ever dawn on them as being a miracle or being important or being something that they should prioritize. So our country was in a hole because of Truman. Eisenhower wasn't much better. To give Ike had an awful first Secretary of Interior called Giveaway McKay. He was as bad as James Watt in the Reagan era. Ike did a readjustment his second term and put in a Republican newspaper man from Nebraska named Fred Seaton, who was pretty good. And Seaton was able to save the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to get Eisenhower to save Anwar. And Eisenhower also did something really important. He demilitarized Antarctica. And so it didn't become a Cold War fighting ground for minerals or the like. So Ike did a few things. Both of those were done in 1960 on his way out of office. But if you look at 45 Hiroshima to the advent of John F. Kennedy, it was not a high water mark in conservation. It was a rearguard action by a few brave souls, ranging from people like, Bernard DeVoto and Harper's Magazine, that would attack the plundering of our national forest in the West. It would include Barry Commoner, a name totally forgotten now, but Barry Commoner in the 1950s was the first to really go after the federal government for radiation sickness. He was a professor at Washington State Washington University in St. Louis, and he started doing a big baby teeth collecting. And by studying the teeth of babies that were born before the fallout, nuclear fallout, and then after, and he was able to prove that this strontium 90 and other compounds were poisoning people, not just in Nevada and Utah, not just downwinders, but even in the East Coast, even as far away as New York. And that milk was contaminated, and that our cattle were contaminated. And so they're brave voices, but they're very rear guard. Linus Pauling, who won a Nobel, was very adamant about stopping of nuclear testing. Barry Commoner, and Rachel Carson in the 40s and 50s is part of that. She had worked in FDR's U.S. Fish and Wildlife. She wrote scripts about fish. She had from Springdale, Pennsylvania, but had gone on and earned a master's in zoology at Johns Hopkins, worked at Woods Hole, which is a big part in Massachusetts of my book. Woods Hole was ground zero for ocean studies, still is. But back before we had many of now you have a lot of different outposts, someplace like University of Texas and Corpus Christi and Port Aransas and Texas A&M, or University of Miami and Florida and San Diego. There are a lot of marine study places, but the real leader has been Woods Hole, and Rachel Carson studied oceans there. And she went on to write a beautiful trilogy of books about our oceans. Books, things like books like The Sea Is Around Us is one of my favorite books of all time. And she writes about the creatures along the shorelines. These are beautiful award-winning books Rachel Carson does. As the best writer I've ever encountered, with maybe the exception of Darwin, is Rachel Carson writing on the oceans. She brings a scientific sensibility, a demand of facts, but she writes in such a beautiful prose fashion. And so she was a big deal in the 50s. Well, she started working for John F. Kennedy to get him elected. And she was actually an advisor on environment for the Democratic Party's political plank in 1960. And another name I need to mention, there are a lot, because I talk about the Wilderness Society and others, but is Sierra Club under the leadership of David Brower. David Brower was from Berkeley. He went hiking around California. He identified a new butterfly when he was young. He climbed all the major peaks of the Sierra. In World War II, he served on our 10th Mountain Division as a ski patrol leader in Italy. He came back, worked for University of California Press, and started working as head of executive director of the Sierra Club. And it's Brower who has the chutzpah to start moving into Washington, D.C., and to start going national on the environment. And he had as a PR tool a great photographer who you all know, Ansel Adams, doing posters of national parks. I mean, Adams is so beautiful, his work. And he also found other photographers that I write about in my book, people like Elliot Porter, who did great photography of Maine and New England and elsewhere. But it's they bring out a book in 1960 called This Is the American Earth. And Nancy Newell and Ansel Adams, David Brower, but they take poems of Thoreau and others, and they mix it with prose about the destruction of our world. And on one hand, you could see photos of beauty, let's just say, for simplicity's sake, redwood trees, and the other, you could see a destroyed landscape. And this book became popular. So the Time met John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was not Theodore Roosevelt and FDR in the sense that he had a green thumb that did gardening and knew his butterflies. And the poet Gary Snyder, who's in my book, a beat poet, Pulitzer Prize winning poet, wrote a poem for children in which he told all children that the lesson to stay together, know the flowers, and always make sure that you're keeping your eye on the natural world, and you stay light, that you have a light spirit, not dark. And Gary Snyder's writing poetry in the late 50s. Jack Kerouac wrote Dharma Bums about young people going into the North Cascades and working as forest rangers. And Walt Disney was doing films about coyote and seals and winning Academy Awards for them. You also had influence of Jacques Cousteau writing about the natural world. Early 1960s, Kennedy years, John C. Lilly's book on man and dolphins came out, for the first time really understanding the intelligence of dolphins, which now we all know, we grow up knowing they're really smart. But this was the first kind of wave of new scientific study about how dolphins communicate. By the late 60s and 70s, that scene moves from dolphins to whales and the whole Save the Whale story. But when Rachel Carson's then in the late 50s decided she had to write a track about DDT, because during World War II, we started spraying DDT. When John F. Kennedy was in the Pacific, he had to get doused with DDT. I mean, if you fought in the Philippines, or you were in Iwo Jima, or you were part of the island hopping campaign in any way, shape, or form, you were sprayed. Good news about DDT is it did kill mosquitoes. And, you know, it's a devil's deal. Nobody thought it was that bad. You get sprayed in it and you're not going to get malaria. So look, I get it. I mean, it was an effective product, but we were spraying it and spraying it and spraying it. And it was Barry Commoner working in a military. Commoner's a genius scientist, did his doctorate at Harvard. And in World War II, he devised the contraptions on planes that sprayed the DDT. But Commoner started studying the effects of the DDT killing of wildlife, birds, and he got deeper and deeper and deeper. So from his own laboratory public science work, he started warning about it. Rachel Carson, having worked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, got reams of data from her fellow scientist at Pawtuxet. Pawtuxet is in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. And thank goodness Franklin D. Roosevelt created it, because Pawtuxet studies the dangers of chemicals, man-made substances on fish and wildlife / humans, and yet to come. And it's at Pawtuxet that they realize, oh my God, this DDT is it's going to create a cancer wave like nobody's ever seen, that everybody's health is at risk. And Carson, having that data, knowing about it, having the also track of the Barry Commoner science and others, started writing Silent Spring. And the beginning is a fable about a doomsday when your town, your village where you're at no longer has birds, no longer has clean air. The trees and flowers are dying. And then she goes on to tell the story of DDT and why it really is a potentially very dangerous substance. She was extremely scientifically careful not to be banning DDT. She's saying this widespread application of it is thoughtless, mindless, and it's got to stop. And her friend is Marjorie Spock, the sister of Dr. Benjamin Spock, famous baby doctor. And Marjorie Spock was living on Long Island. And Marjorie Spock had a big farm, and she was growing organic produce. Well, government planes, Suffolk County planes, sometimes federal agriculture planes, but flying over, they're just spraying everything with DDT, including on her organic farm. And she sues, goes all the way to the Supreme Court saying, I have a right to be an organic farmer. That's my livelihood. And these planes are spraying on my produce. And she didn't win in the Supreme Court, but the dissent written by William O. Douglas backing her was monumental. I get chills because I've looked into it so much. His brilliant writing from the Supreme Court about how the Marjorie Spocks have a democratic right to run the kind of farm she wants, and that no government, the federal government does not own the airspace directly over your property. You can see how complicated air gets, right? I mean, and I'm giving you just one case with DDT here, but Carson not only is working on Silent Spring, but she's diagnosed with breast cancer, has serious relapses with her chemo and all sorts of problems, has to wear a wig, and is continuing like a race to finish Silent Spring before her own demise. And she gets it done. In 1962, she finishes it, and it comes out in New Yorker magazine, serialized it over the June of 62, and the book comes out in the fall of 62, and it's a revolution. The person who stood up for Rachel Carson in a really special way was John F. Kennedy, because Kennedy was a voracious reader. And he had read the New Yorker, and he knew Rachel Carson. Jacqueline Kennedy knew Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson had gone over to Bobby Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy's home. And he loved her books about the ocean, because that's what Kennedy cared about on the personal side of his life. And he had created Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961. John F. Kennedy created Padre Island National Seashore in Texas, and it was a big fight. Lyndon Johnson, his own VP from Texas, did not want Padre Island. meaning massive amount of land on the Gulf of Mexico where nothing's going to be built except to save it as a wildlife refuge and a hiking park with a little camping. And Kennedy fought for that with the help of Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas and got it done. And then with the Sierra Club pitching in mightily, they get Point Reyes National Seashore done, Kennedy, which is the area in Marin County north, the Golden Gate Bridge there, a beautiful landscape, Point Reyes, California. The point is Kennedy went at 3 very hard places to get his national parks. Cape Cod, the whole coastal area of Texas, and all the land of the ocean north of San Francisco and rich Marin County. And those were big, meaning it's easier to save the Brooks Range in Alaska. Oh, here's a bunch of acreage, big mountains, no timber, call it a park. But Kennedy went to very, very important areas that he saved. So he was on board with the environmentalist. And when Carson's book came out, he then said at the podium that, yes, I'm looking at, and asked about pesticides. So he said, I'm ready because of Rachel Carson, Miss Carson's book. He then ordered a presidential science advisory committee, which is what a president should do, and said, look, here's her book, and I'm willing to hire the best scientist to say whether she's right or not. Let's look at her. We'll come up. Well, they did. And a year later, they found Rachel Carson to be correct. And so the Kennedy administration starts looking at for the effort to start banning certain types of pesticides, chemicals. It will take a decade. DDT is not banned for spraying use in the United States till 1972. One whole decade of silent spring fighting, and many winning people took the cause. One is the Environmental Defense Fund, founded in 1967 under the Montrose Sue the Bastards. One was the National Resource Defense Council, founded in 1970. And the hero of the Nixon years, a man named William Ruckelshaus, who was a Republican from Indiana, became the first head of EPA and was really a straight shooter when it came to organizing the new EPA, which was created in 1970, but doing it with vigorous science, fact-based judgment. And Ruckelshaus, again, like the Kennedy administration, said, I'm going to look at the science, and if it's bad for human health, it's going to get bad. And alas, it was. And so Kennedy, we all know, is assassinated in 1963. Rachel Carson dies in 1964. But both of their legacies are so large and continue. And in my book, I pick up on the work that Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson did in the 1960s. We owe Lyndon Johnson a great deal of thanks for he came up kind of with this idea himself. I mean, I write the backstory that was this group, the Craighead brothers in the 1950s, and a Republican Congressman, John Salyer from Pennsylvania. And, there are others. But for the president of the United States, he felt it was his idea to save hunks of rivers and declare it wild and scenic rivers. And Johnson stayed on it to his credit. And in the fall of 1968, before he left office, he was able to pass the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So today we have rivers that aren't dammed, that aren't being industrialized, that aren't being polluted, that we're keeping in somewhat, nothing is pure from human, touches. But places like the Allagash up in Maine, that, Thoreau country up there, or places, like the Snake River in Salmon and others in Idaho, and places like the Oregon, which is filled today with wild and scenic rivers, and some in Florida and some in Ohio and Minnesota, Wisconsin. Great thing. I mean, if we were fair to Lyndon Johnson, we'd call it the Lyndon Johnson Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. He did a lot for it. Same time in 1968, he did National Scenic Trails. Lyndon Johnson pulled off the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, and many more. And he also, with his own shoulder to the wheel, got through Redwood National Park in California and North Cascades and in Washington State. I don't mean Johnson did this on his own. Obviously, there are all sorts of lawmakers in the mix. And the big ones were Ed Muskie of Maine, who fought against pollution and pro-environment, Frank Church of Idaho, Clinton Anderson of New Mexico. And so, there were, and Scoop Jackson, Washington State, and many others, but they got it done. And then Lady Bird is extraordinary first lady. I rank her second after Eleanor Roosevelt. That's sort of in a realm of her own. But Lady Bird Johnson taking on beautification, she wanted to call it environmentalism, but the Johnson's boys, as she put it, made her say beautification, which sounded like a gendered word of some. So she never liked that it was her beautification project. But nevertheless, what she tried to do was go back to what we used to call the City Beautiful movement. Make sure every city's green, trees planted, garbage picked up. She would go with blue jeans on to the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. and spend days picking up garbage and talking about the need to make rivers and lakes swimmable. And with Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall, she would go hike to places like Big Bend National Park or go whitewater rafting in Idaho and go to Redwood National Park, bring a consciousness to these efforts to save treasured landscapes. She's probably most well known for her anti-billboard campaign of stopping vulgar commercialization along scenic highways. But where I'm talking to you from right now, I'm in Austin, Texas, and she is really responsible in Austin for Zilker Park, which is one of the great public parks in America. It's like the Central Park of here, but it saves the waterways, aquifer, endangered species here. And then with the University of Texas, she built the National Wildlife Research Center to how to keep American wildlife. So she's an important person, Lady Bird, and Lyndon followed her lead on a lot of these things, and it was a good, smart lead. But alas, the Vietnam War, 58,000 dead, untold, maimed, country divided under an unnecessary war. Vietnam was a fiasco, and Lyndon Johnson deserves a lot of the blame for all of that. And so when you're looking at a president like LBJ, you have to see the good and the bad, and I do that in the book. Also, William O. Douglas from the Supreme Court thought Johnson was constantly half-loafing these parks. Like he created Canyonlands in Utah, but instead of fighting for the original 1,000,000 acres, Johnson would boil it down to 400,000 acres. When the real Silent Spring revolutionaries wanted more. Johnson was not part of their ilk, but Lady Bird was. And so there's a difference there. And then Nixon comes in, and Richard Nixon gets sworn in 69. And just days later, you have the Santa Barbara oil spill. And, it's not Nixon's fault. He's president in 8 days. There are other people's faults for the bad piping, the lofty licks. He just became president. And he had a beautiful home on San Clemente on the ocean. And we forget California in 1969 still was a powerful Republican state. I mean, yeah, it went both ways, but, Ronald Reagan had been governor. I mean, and Nixon heard it from all the NIMBY, not in my backyard, Republican donors, meaning Republicans who have beautiful homes in special places, whether it's Carmel or San Luis Obispo or Ventura or, Laguna Beach. That said, look, what is this oil spill stuff? We know we're not very keen on having oil derricks in our backyard, period. And so Nixon heard them, which a responsive politician would. And then he had in the summer of 69, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire in Ohio. Here, Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon, and you have the rivers in Ohio on fire. That river was constantly going on fire, but so was the Rouge River in Michigan, and so were others. Lake Erie was dying. Kurt Vonnegut said Lake Erie had died due to excrement and Clorox bottles. I mean, it was a wreck. And Nixon, and when Time magazine put Cuyahoga on the cover of fires going on, Nixon knew he had to do something. And by the late, when Nixon despised one person in the Democratic Party more than anybody, and that was Ed Muskie. And Muskie was trying to come up with very progressive environmental policy. And Scoob Jackson, another Democrat, was coming up with it. And Nixon tells John Ehrlichman, his domestic advisor, who was an environmental lawyer from Seattle, if Scoop does it, I'll listen. Anything that Muskie does, I want nothing to do with. So Scoop Jackson's Senate office got churning out some good stuff. Scoop hired some good, what we today would call environmental lawyers. And by NEPA, the Environmental Policy Act, Nixon signs it on New Year's Day, 1970 at his home in San Clemente. And that gives us today's environmental impact statements. And it was not thought through by Nixon, but Nixon, to his credit, signed off on it. He gave Scoop Jackson and John Dingell a little bit of credit on the, Dingell was a Michigan congressman. And there was NEPA, start of 1970. Then January 22nd, 70, Nixon gives a State of the Union address in which like 3/4 of it's about the environment. And then Earth Day hits. And April 22nd, 1970, I would like everybody in this call to understand Earth Day was largely funded by Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers. Reuther was another one of these Silent Spring revolutionaries. The head of the auto union thought all workers, all blue-collar workers, had a right to clean rivers, clean lakes, to hunt, to fish, to camp, that working people couldn't afford to go to Tahiti and Bali. The working people, say in Detroit, would have to go to northern Detroit and deserve to have public parks that were clean. And Gaylord Nelson, the senator of Wisconsin, was the leading politician on the first Earth Day. Dennis Hayes ran the youth organization. Lo and behold, Earth Day was a huge success. It was carried like a convention. Every city had these teach-ins and Earth Day events. Nixon played it both ways. But largely Nixon thought Earth Day was a socialist trick, that it was an anti-American trick, but he also allowed his Interior Department the day off for Earth Day employees, and not wanting to seem totally out of it, he wouldn't give a speech or anything for Earth Day, Nixon, but he did plant a tree on the White House ground to show he was doing a tree planting. And after Earth Day, then Nixon goes for it and they sign in the summer, they create today's NOAA and the EPA. And the EPA opens its doors for business in December of 1970. And under Ruckelshaus as head of it, it was quite a run. Ruckelshaus hired all the right people. He brought in the right lawyers, scientists. He did it the right way. We're today trying to keep an EPA like Ruckelshaus started. It had a good roots. It's now been politicized in all these different ways. What Ruckelshaus was good at was law enforcement. We're enforcing it. He told the city of Atlanta, the federal government is going to crack down on you if you don't clean up your water supply and get proper federal and sewage treatment. And in fact, Ruckelshaus told me before he died that the big problem in environmental history, or Thoreauvians like us, is we don't give credit to sewage treatment. That the people don't want to go do their PhD at Yale on the history of sewage plants. And that instead, everybody wants to write about Yellowstone or Walden, and that this movement of sewage treatment that gave birth in the 70s, he thought was environmentally game-changing. And so I looked into it, and you can see how right Ruckelshaus was, that we probably all take that aspect of modernity in America for granted, that we just flush and things go away, and we're not, most places, not afraid to drink our tap water and the like. Nixon did Clean Air and signed the Water Act, or he did not. He would veto the Clean Water Act. He thought it was a Muskie trap. and then 73 endangered species, and then things go kind of kaputs. I talked to Nixon's family, and I said, look, Kennedy's got this environmental legacy with the oceans and Rachel Carson and all. The Johnsons have the ranch, ranch culture and a connection to the land. And I said, Nixon, every time I see him wearing a suit and wingtips standing on a beach or something, but there's no Nixon in outdoors images. And so Tricia Nixon Cox wrote me a long letter about what she considered why Nixon actually cared a great deal about the land and water, and why he did some of this. What Nixon seemed to have a personal interest in was marine mammal protection. He signed a very progressive act and got involved with the Pentagon's, the Defense Department, stopping the killing of whales. And Nixon saw the redwoods and the sequoias as the symbol of California greatness. And when we got our panda bears from China on his famous visit, our gift to China were seedlings, saplings of redwoods and sequoias as a symbol of America. So, I try to give Nixon a fair shake as much as you can, because not only does he have the sins of Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and all, but all of the Watergate and the corruption and the distrust. So it's not a revision of Nixon, but I try as a historian to say who's in the game and who's not, who's really been willing to try to keep the planet cleaner, greener, safer, who at least does things in that realm, and try to give them their moment in the sun. I'll end and then open it for questions by just saying, I just adore Rachel Carson, nothing like her. Read her Sea trilogy. Only Henry David Thoreau is in her category of being able to write about the natural world with the beauty, and in my mind, that she's able to. And I hope you all enjoy the book. I deal with environmental justice issues. I deal with Dr. Martin Luther King, working for getting lead out of paint, and he got killed at the garbage workers strike in Memphis, and his comments about the garment of destiny. His thinking is very ecological. And Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers and their fighting against pesticides. And it's all folded into this narrative, which really goes from 1945 to 1973. But the spirit, the soul of this book, it's part of yet another part of the long legacy of Henry David Thoreau, my person that means the most to me in the annals of history and literature. So thank you for indulging me. I hope you enjoy the book, and we'll open it up for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. That was wonderful. I'm so happy we're recording it because I ran out of sticky notes, so I can go back and watch again. We have lots of questions so far, so I'll jump right in. Just a reminder, people are putting them in the chat, which is fine, but you can also put them in the Q&A box. I'll just toggle back and forth between the two. First question from Tom, great question, kind of a two-parter, but what are the most likely drivers today of the climate change tipping point? Without naming individuals, do you see likely candidates for presidency over the next two elections who can provide the leadership the country needs to create some real support and commitment of relevant policy? How about corporate leaders? So 3 questions.
Well, it's a great questions there, though. But I mean, I'm a big admirer of Bill McKibben and what he's trying to do as a Paul Revere-like figure of alarming, constantly reminding us, James Hansen and others, but of the climate threat. The Sunrise Movement is doing so much, but I'm thinking of major politicians. I'm not finding, Inslee of Washington tried to put it at his front, and Murray, who's up for re-election. A lot comes out of Washington and Oregon, in my mind, today. A lot of thinking about it, but it's a larger problem. We're dealing now When I go to Ohio, I'm just saying I grew up near Toledo, and if I go to a group in Ohio, if I talk about the wilderness, or let's just say this, if I say, let's all have Lake Erie clean so we can swim in it and have the fish back, I get a standing ovation from everybody. If I use the word climate change, half the audience thinks I'm a stalking horse for the Democratic Party. And until we can be Americans and see this as a global and that we need to be a leader, unfortunately, there's the green lobby on the left, and then there's the oil and gas industry lobby on the right, and they just part. There used to be this sort of cross, waving. Doesn't happen anymore now. People are just siloed off into these two. So who would be a leader who can break through that? It's hard to tell. I think it has to be somebody running that climate change is the most important thing the United States can do for national security, for homeland security, for taxpayers, for American leadership in the 21st century. Are we just going to keep having Fort Myers's and Sanibel Islands and Captiva wiped from existence over and over again? Are we going to just lose all the forest of California? When will we get off of fossil fuels? And we're not there. I mean, at the rate we're going now, that we're going to be with it for a while, because oil's plentiful in places like Venezuela and Saudi Arabia and Russia. And whenever gas prices go up, environmentalists have a hard time. It's so tied together, all of this. So I don't have a magic fix per se. I was happy with Bill Clinton's leadership on conservation. I was happy with Barack Obama's, but here we are, we're still not able to really tackle the big problem of our time. And the fact that something like, almost 30% of Americans think climate change is exaggerated or a hoax, it makes it hard on the public square.
Yeah, absolutely. Second question, who do you consider the leading environmentalists today, the true visionaries, the true leaders?
I think in the end, it's our scientists, again, the experts that are putting out this data. I mean, when we're looking at our science community, they're pretty much like 98% or more in agreement. But they're not scientists that become publicly known. One of the neat things about writing Silent Spring is that the scientists, like on Earth Day, Barry Commoner was Echo Buddy with Walter Cronkite. Rachel Carson was doing an hour special with Eric Severide on CBS Reports. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson would have Paul Ehrlich on talking about population growth, and then we had the music songs, people like Joni Mitchell and Pete Seeger on the Hudson, and Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, The Ecology. The pop culture kind of moved into that now. I think where the issue of our time seems to be a race post George Floyd. And, Dr. King warned, he said, look, what good does it do to integrate a lunch counter if the milk you're drinking at the lunch counter is contaminated with radiation for the drinker? That, we have to put the protection of planetary stewardship as the issue, the way TR did. And until a leader really can get going on that, I mean, I think Kamala Harris knows a lot about climate change, but she's seeming unable to get out in the front of it as a defining issue. You have somebody like Beto O'Rourke, where I'm at in Texas, very knowledgeable and leading on it in a positive, interesting way, but it's going to be hard for him to win. And so the reality of this divided America 50-50 makes it hard to pull together. I think California, not to deflect from the question in any way, shape, or form, but I would look at it instead of individuals, more as states. I think what California is trying to do by 2035, you're not going to be able to, they're trying to get not sell gasoline and not have the cars by 2035, that you're going to have chargers or find new alternatives. It's going to be states that start it. I think the Pacific Northwest is our best chance, Washington, Oregon, and California. I think the revolution, the new environmental movement is really going to come out of the West.
Mm-hmm. And you write of the rearguard 50s. What about Edwin Way Teal, the first Pulitzer Prize winner for nature writing?
Oh, yeah. And what an incredible, great question. And he was just beautiful and amazing. There's also Teal. I deal with Edward Abbey, who wrote a book called Desert Solitaire, which was remarkable. And that came out in 1968. And was a really powerful book. Stuart Brand, who had did the Whole Earth Catalog. Remember, we were going to the moon, but when all the astronauts returned, they said it wasn't the moon that blew me away. It was seeing lonely, fragile Earth, the blue-green planet, and how vulnerable we are. This whole idea that was propagated by Buckminster Fuller of, kind of spaceship Earth. We're floating out in the cosmos on our own. So that way, something like NASA and Apollo folded in to environmental movement. And today, we're very lucky. Our satellite culture, our space culture, is giving us our maps of climate changes. And every day we're following these, we're seeing the trends and what's happening. There also were a lot of beautiful writers about animals that led to endangered species. Endangered Species Act was three-pronged, one in 1996. And the big animal they tried to use as the poster never quite caught on, but it was the key deer of Florida, a small, very attractive little type of deer. And if you pull it up online, you'll see. But then by the 69, we had one, but the real one of today was 73. And it was the bald eagle that really became the symbol, because DDT was killing eagles, osprey, as Kathy mentioned at the outset, pelican, their eggs were thinning and DDT was decimating them, perhaps to the point of extinction. And the idea, if the United States was going to let the symbol of our country, the eagle, go extinct, what kind of country were we? But a lot of those endangered species acts of rethinking about life were by biologists that were good writers. I write about a man named Archie Carr. If you look at a map on Florida today, between Vero Beach and Jacksonville, you'll see the Archie Carr National Wildlife Refuge. This is our key Florida sea turtle hatching area. And Archie Carr wrote beautiful books about sea turtles. He wrote about the Everglades. He wrote about the Caribbean ecology. A man named, and he was taught in Florida, a man named Eugene Odom wrote a textbook on ecology in the 50s, and suddenly you were teaching ecology at universities. So now we need to make it mandatory to have class on climate change in middle school and high schools. I mean, we're going to have to go to that generation. They're already interested. But I'm a professor at Rice, and sometimes students will feel overwhelmed by climate. It's like, oh my God, how do we realistically grapple with it? And I tell them to relax and have fun, and embrace something like the Walden Woods project, or embrace a one state park or one species, or do your little bit, give a little bit of money, write some things for a newsletter. You can have some victories. You can find something that you can do that makes a difference. If getting into the high game policy of the climate problem is depressing you, by all means, be optimistic and put your use to maybe fighting to clean a river, or stop a particular dam from destroying one, or trying to save the salmon in Oregon, or the condor in California, and put your upbeat shoulder to the wheel, because there's so many issues out there of places that need protected. And what Don Henley did and Kathy Anderson and what you guys did at the Walden Woods Project, go right into a congested area, say this is a sacred national landscape, that the power of Walden, even in the 21st century, is large, and you went to work and now have saved an area that people can enjoy for recreation, contemplation. It's good for the wildlife. It's good for the soul. It keeps people's anger down. It's, but there's a Walden everywhere. There's a Walden outside of Topeka. There's a Walden in, Chicago. I write in my book about the old-time poet. He was the grand old man of poetry in the 1960s, Carl Sandburg, lobbying to create the Indiana Dunes in Indiana by Gary, Indiana smokestack factories, blighted landscapes. There was a section of dunes that he was determined to save, and he did. But as we all know, conservation, you got to go back to the well, all in all, because now with climate change and water differences and the like, the ecosystem's changing and the dunes are disappearing. So now you have to continue to fight for the dunes in a new way. But the number of people that are part of it, it builds up at a period of time. And then there's a tipping point, and then you have a revolutionary mind. And I think we're getting there with climate change, but we're not there this midterm election season.
Yeah, I love your answer, because especially for my generation, millennials, that is the often, like, you don't want to even think about it because it's it just seems so damning. But we had Bill Muma too a month ago, and his answer to a question like this was very similar. Take a more positive outlook on it. You can do it because he knows individuals that have made a difference.
And think locally sometimes. Well, take where you're living and say, what can I do to help the ecology of a urban scape or a rural town? It doesn't matter, but what can I do to help? And then you'll make a lot of friends. I mean, you'll find people that are on the same cause with you, and it just feels good to save a particular treasured landscape because that you leaned in and did something, and that'll get you started perhaps on larger things. But to just take on climate at first, I mean, you won't be able to sleep.
Yeah, certainly. Next question, you mentioned importance of the legacy of national parks in the 1960s. What role do you see for creating new national parks in the 21st century to address climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and the need for healthy green space for our people?
Boy, what a great question. I love healthy green space. When hearing you recite that, there's an effort going on, for example, the American Prairie Reserve out in Montana along the Missouri River, of trying to amass 3 million acres of lands to kind of protect some of the prairie. So you can individualize efforts, but the larger question is climate's changing everything. I mean, what do we do with wildlife corridors? How do we create new ones? I mean, do you know how disheartening it was for me to be writing about Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird and the saving of Redwood National Park, and right when book's about to come out, you're watching California burn? It's tough out there and in this environment. So, we'll have to, just have to go a day at a time on this. But the parks have to, I think, for example, Bears Ear National Park, National Monument in Utah, Barack Obama was trying to have indigenous people run the park. Like, do these national parks have to always be run out of Washington, D.C. by, uniformed police officers? I'm not suggesting that there's a compromise that needs to go on in some of theirs, but we have to, I think we need to listen more to Native Americans on some of their ecology, land management issues, sustainable living. They have a lot of answers, or at least have a lot of potential answers that are worth trying out. And meanwhile, you have to stop things like the Keystone Pipeline that became so large, or fracking in areas that should not be fracked, like the Catskills or Adirondacks. And so it's just battles going on everywhere. Be a soldier, pick your battle, and do it with goodwill and love, and believe in the power of somebody like Thoreau, who, his whole idea of township parks is really about green space, about having places to go to be human. And then I also write in my book, Rachel Carson was a big fan of Dr. Albert Schweitzer, Nobel winner, who wrote about a reverence for life and how to look at all birds, all species you see, with a certain way of looking at them that's not one of dominance and destruction, but one of cohabitation of the American earth.
All right, we have about 2 more. Is that okay?
All right, we'll do 2 more.
Okay. So Barry Commoner, Murray Bookchin, Naomi Klein, and many others have said that capitalism is inherently anti-ecological and that no real progress can be made because of the growth-oriented system. Your thoughts on this?
They have, and I respect their writings, but in the end, America is a capitalist society, and the solutions to a lot of our problems are going to come through innovation. What if Elon Musk is doing Teslas? I mean, that's a prototype, but getting Ford Motor to start getting off, and many of the auto companies have said we're ready to get off of gasoline. I mean, we're ready to do the transition. We're trying to sell car units. What they're run on doesn't matter to me. Trying to make buildings more sustainable and ecologically friendly, being green certified on campuses and schools, getting rid of the horrors of asbestos or other kind of chemical types of contaminants that have made indoor living bad. I mean, a lot of those solutions are going to come from corporate America, in the sense that I think that with proper leadership, we're going to have to get a group of, let's call it 100 companies that really want to work on environmental stewardship and bring in the profit structure into trying to make America the special land I could do this whole talk in a global way. I was focusing more on the United States, particularly today, but this is a global problem. What do we do here in the United States when we stop coal mining here, but China, does it 20 times higher than they are right now? And what does that mean for the planet? So the questions are large. I'm right now just trying to get rid of, some of these dams have destroyed the Colorado River. The Glen Canyon Dam was a horrible mess. Many of the dams in Washington and Oregon today are unnecessary and are killing the environment. So we've got to kind of undo some of the damage we've done too. But I don't see in this country any way forward without corporate partnership. It just won't happen because America was built as a capitalist society. You're going to go the other route. You're going to have to say, well, what country is your example and how can it work? The idea that capitalism is disappearing from the United States anytime soon seems far-fetched to me.
Last question, which I think is a good question to wrap it up with. Any big surprises for you while you were writing the book?
There are many all the time, but one that jumped to mind is this idea that there's some people that didn't like the Wilderness Act of 1964 when Johnson started a system of wilderness preservation, putting aside in his day 9.1 million acres. There's some people that say there is no such thing as wilderness. The Wilderness Act is no roads, no construction, no development, trying to limit the imprint of humans. So there's some parcels of landscape that are quasi untouched. Why some people don't like that idea, I don't know. They're feeling that it's elitist, that it doesn't deal with environmental problems of how people live. but I don't trust humans to the sense that if if a road goes into some of the Tongass, it eventually will get clear cut in Alaska due to the problems of a greed-oriented mentality. So I think the federal government's provisions, protections of wilderness areas is important to keep going, and we should be looking for more wilderness opportunities, not bemoaning some of its shortcomings or some of its difficulties in the age of climate.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much, Doug. This was such a wonderful presentation. It is being recorded, so we'll get that up on our website and on YouTube in the next day or two. A reminder to keep an eye out for Doug's book on 11/15. We will have it for sale at walden.org in our bookshop very soon. We can email everyone when that is all set. And lastly, the Walden Woods Project and Restore have been offering our virtual lectures for free, and we will continue to do so. We have more this winter. You can find those at walden.org. And if anyone wants or is able to make a donation to either or both nonprofits, we would be so very grateful. And mostly thank you for joining us tonight. And we look forward to more events in the future. And thank you again, Doug.
Hey, thank you, everybody. You take care.
Thank you, Doug.
Bye.